Levi sat alone, his back pressed against the rough bark of a tree that had stood longer than any human had ever known. The wind whispered through the jagged leaves above him, carrying with it the scent of wet earth and distant rain. It was the kind of silence that could swallow a person whole, the kind of quiet that crept into the bones, sinking deeper than the noise of the human world. His gaze drifted toward the horizon, where the edges of the colony barely broke the line of trees. From where he sat, the towering structures of the settlement seemed small, insignificant, like an intrusion in a world that did not belong to them. Levi had always felt that way about the colony, like it wasn't truly home. His parents called it progress, the expanding reach of humanity across the stars, but Levi couldn't shake the feeling that it was something else. The forest made more sense to him than those metal walls ever would. Caldara wasn't like Earth. It was vast, untamed, and dangerous in ways that the settlers never quite seemed to understand. The adults spoke of control, of bending the planet to their will, but Levi had seen enough of Caldara to know that it didn't bend. It moved on its own terms, growing, shifting, living, and there was no force strong enough to master it. The settlers tried to carve their existence here, but the planet never welcomed them. There was a quiet indifference in the air, a sense that everything around them watched, waited, and tolerated them only for as long as they didn't overstep. Levi liked that. He understood it. Animals made sense, the way they lived without pretense or expectation. They moved by instinct, by the simple rules of survival, not by power or ambition. They didn't try to change what they were. Humans did. He heard the rustling of movement in the underbrush behind him and didn't turn around. He knew what it was without looking. A small creature, a quora, one of the native animals of Caldara. It had been following him for days now, keeping its distance, never approaching. At first, he hadn't noticed it. But over time, its presence had become something familiar, almost comforting. It didn't bother him. Unlike the other kids in the colony, who either ignored him or ridiculed him for preferring the company of the wilderness, the quora didn't judge. It simply existed, like him. He had tried to explain it once to his father, the feeling he got from the forest, the pull of the wild. His father hadn't understood. "We're meant to conquer it, Levi," he had said, eyes narrowing in the way they always did when he talked about the future. "That's why we're here, to make it ours. This planet will either submit to us, or it will break." Levi had said nothing in response, though the words stayed with him, growing like a splinter lodged too deep to remove. It didn't seem right. The idea that they had come all this way to bend a world to their will, to force something so vast and alive into submission. His father was wrong, but Levi knew better than to say it. The settlers believed what they believed, and they had no room for the thoughts of a 12-year-old who spent more time in the woods than in their homes. The quora crept closer, its sleek body moving through the grass in near silence. Levi glanced at it, meeting its eyes for the first time. There was something there, something ancient and knowing. Though it wasn't fear, it was curiosity. The creature didn't see him as a threat. And in that moment, Levi understood why. He wasn't like the others. He didn't belong to the colony, not really. He was part of the wild, even if he didn't know it yet. A distant rumble of thunder broke the quiet, rolling across the sky like a warning. Levi stood, brushing the dirt from his pants as he glanced back toward the settlement. They would be looking for him soon. His parents always worried when the storms came, though they never seemed to worry about the right things. There were far worse things in the wild than rain. As he walked, the quora followed at a distance, keeping just out of reach, but always present. It felt like a shadow, a reflection of something Levi couldn't quite name. The air grew heavier with each step, the storm drawing nearer, but Levi didn't hurry. He had learned long ago that the forest demanded patience, not fear. The trees had stood for centuries. They weren't bothered by a little rain. The settlement walls loomed ahead, tall and unforgiving, their sharp edges stark against the natural world that surrounded them. Levi paused just before the tree line, hesitating in the space between two worlds. He could feel at the boundary. On one side, the controlled, manufactured existence of the colony. On the other, the raw, untamed freedom of Caldara. He didn't want to cross that line. It felt wrong, like stepping into a cage. But he had to. The wild wasn't his place, not yet. He was still tethered to the world of humans, still bound by the expectations of those who had brought him here. One day, though, he would leave. He knew it as surely as he knew the storm was coming. This place, this planet, wasn't meant to be conquered. It was meant to be lived with, to be respected, and Levi could feel that truth deep in his bones. The Quora stopped at the edge of the trees, watching as Levi made his way toward the colony gate. It didn't follow him this time. Maybe it understood what Levi was beginning to understand, that there were some boundaries even he couldn't cross. Not yet. The gate opened with a metallic hiss, and Levi stepped inside, the cold, sterile air of the colony hitting him like a slap to the face. It always felt wrong, like the air wasn't real. He missed the scent of the forest, the feeling of the wind against his skin. Here, everything was controlled, artificial. Even the sky was a dull, muted gray, as if the planet itself had been dimmed by the presence of humanity. Levi! His mother's voice cut through the noise, sharp with worry. She stood near the entrance to their home, her eyes scanning the crowd until they landed on him. Relief washed over her face, but Levi didn't feel the same. The storm was coming, and it wasn't the one in the sky. He knew the tension in the colony had been building for weeks. The settlers were on edge, talking in hushed voices about the dangers lurking in the wilderness. Some spoke of the Hralok, a creature so massive and powerful that it was said to have destroyed entire scouting teams. Others whispered of the Elara, an alien species that lived just beyond Caldara's borders, watching, waiting. Levi didn't care about the rumors. He knew the real danger wasn't out there in the forest. It was here, inside the walls, in the minds of those who believed they could bend this planet to their will. It was in the quiet fear that gripped them, the fear of the unknown, the fear that maybe, just maybe, humanity wasn't as invincible as they thought. "Where have you been?" His mother's voice was softer now, but the concern lingered in her eyes. "You know you're not supposed to go out there alone." "I wasn't alone," Levi replied, his gaze drifting back toward the trees, though the Quora was long gone. "Not really." She didn't understand. She never did. Levi followed her inside, the weight of the forest still clinging to him. The walls closed in around him, the air thick with the scent of metal and machines. He felt trapped, but it wouldn't last. One day, the wild would call him back, and this time he wouldn't return. The storm outside grew louder, but Levi didn't listen. His thoughts were somewhere else, far beyond the walls, deep in the heart of a world that didn't need taming. It only needed to be understood. The air was different today. It clung to the skin with a kind of tension that hadn't been there before, as if the very atmosphere was aware of what was to come. Levi stood at the edge of the colony's boundary, where the walls met the forest, watching the tree line with a silent intensity that matched the stillness of the land. He felt it in his chest, like a quiet storm building in the distance, though the sky was clear and cloudless. There was no wind, no sound of birds or insects, only the oppressive quiet of a world waiting. The elders of the colony had spoken in hushed tones all morning, their voices carrying through the halls like ghosts from another time. Something was happening, something bigger than the usual disputes over resources or expansion. Levi had tried to listen, to understand what they weren't saying aloud, but the adults had a way of speaking that left him on the outside. He wasn't meant to know yet, wasn't supposed to understand the weight of what was coming. But he did. He knew, because Caldara had a way of telling those who listened, and Levi had been listening for a long time. The Quora had been absent for days now. He hadn't seen it since the last storm, though he wasn't worried. The creatures of the wild knew when to hide, when to step back and let something else take its place. They felt the shift long before humans did, retreating into the shadows, into the safety of the trees. Levi had considered following them once, disappearing into the forest and leaving the colony behind, but something always held him back. Now, standing there in the quiet, he wondered if the Quora had felt the same pull, the same sense that something was coming, something that couldn't be avoided. "Levi." His father's voice broke through the stillness, sharp and direct, a stark contrast to the calm around them. "Come inside. Now." Levi turned slowly, his eyes lingering on the forest one last time before he faced his father. The man stood rigid at the gate, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, as if the very act of standing there required all his strength. There was a look in his eyes that Levi hadn't seen before, not anger, but something colder, something distant. "Why?" Levi asked, though he already knew the answer. The adults always wanted him inside when something important was happening, as if walls could keep the world at bay. His father didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took a step closer, his voice low and hard. "The council is meeting. It's not safe for you to be out here." Levi frowned, glancing back at the forest before replying. Safe from what? The silence that followed was heavy, pressing against his chest like a weight. His father didn't look at him when he spoke again, his gaze fixed on something far away, something Levi couldn't see. "They're coming." It wasn't the first time Levi had heard those words. The Elara had been a whisper among the colony for months now, a shadow that moved at the edges of their understanding. No one had seen them, not really, but their presence was always felt. The elders spoke of them with a mixture of fear and awe, as if the mere idea of these beings was enough to unsettle the balance they had worked so hard to build. The Elara were not conquerors like humans. They didn't seek to bend the world to their will, to carve out territories or claim resources. They were something else, something older, something that lived in the spaces between things. The settlers called them primitive, but Levi knew better. Primitive creatures didn't inspire the kind of fear he saw in his father's eyes. "They want a meeting," his father continued, his voice tight with something Levi couldn't place. "A delegation. The council doesn't trust them." Levi didn't respond. There was nothing to say. The Elara had been watching them for as long as the colony had been here, observing from a distance, waiting. The settlers had always expected a confrontation, had built walls and defenses in preparation for the day the Elara would come to drive them out. But Levi had a different feeling about it. The Elara weren't coming for a fight. They were coming for something else, something that no one in the colony could understand. Hours passed before the gates opened again. Levi sat on the roof of his home, hidden from view, as the council gathered in the main square below. His father was there, standing with the other leaders of the colony, his face hard and unreadable. They spoke in low voices, their words too quiet to make out, but Levi didn't need to hear them. He knew what they were talking about. The Elara. The crowd grew quiet as the gates swung open, the heavy creak of metal echoing through the square. At first, nothing happened. The space beyond the walls seemed to stretch out forever, the trees standing still as statues in the distance. Then, a figure appeared, stepping through the open gate with a grace that was almost unnatural. Hralok. Levi's breath caught in his throat as the Elara leader emerged from the shadows, his tall, slender form moving with a quiet power that was both unsettling and mesmerizing. His skin was a deep, earthy green, like the leaves of the trees, and his eyes, large and almond-shaped, seemed to glow with a light that wasn't entirely of this world. He moved with purpose, each step deliberate, as if the ground itself bent to his will. There was no fear in his movements, no hesitation. He walked among the humans as if they weren't there at all, as if their presence was of no consequence. His gaze swept over the crowd, his expression unreadable, until it landed on Levi. For a brief moment, their eyes met. Levi felt something stir inside him, something he couldn't name. It wasn't fear, but it wasn't curiosity either. It was deeper than that, more primal, as if Hralok was seeing something in him that no one else had ever seen before. Then, just as quickly, the moment passed, and Hralok turned his attention back to the council. The tension in the air thickened as the elders stepped forward to meet him, their faces a mixture of caution and defiance. They didn't trust him. They couldn't. The Elara were too different, too foreign, their ways too strange for the settlers to comprehend. Hralok spoke then, his voice soft but strong, carrying across the square like a whisper on the wind. His words were strange, unfamiliar, though the meaning behind them was clear. "We are not here for war." The council leader, a tall, broad-shouldered man named Orlin, stepped forward, his jaw clenched. "Then why are you here?" Hralok's eyes met his, calm and unblinking. "We are here because you are." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. The council didn't respond, their silence speaking louder than any words could. Levi watched from above, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't fully understand what was happening, but he could feel the weight of it. This wasn't just a meeting. This was something far more important, something that would change everything. Hralok's gaze shifted again, this time landing on Levi's father. "You have brought something here that does not belong." Levi's father stiffened, his hands curling into fists at his sides. "What are you talking about?" Hralok didn't answer immediately. He turned, his eyes scanning the crowd, before speaking again. "This planet, it is not yours to take. You do not belong here, and yet you remain. Why?" The question was simple, but its implications were vast. The settlers had always believed they had a right to this place, that their expansion across the stars was a natural progression, but the Elara saw it differently. To them, the humans were invaders, a species that took what wasn't theirs, bending the world to their will without thought or consequence. "We have a right to be here," Orlan said, his voice hard. "We've built this colony with our own hands. We've fought for it." Hralok's gaze softened, almost imperceptibly. "And yet, the land does not fight for you." The council fell silent. Levi could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating. This wasn't just a battle of words. This was a battle of ideals, of worldviews that could not coexist. The Elara saw the world as something to live with, to coexist with, while the humans saw it as something to conquer, to control. Levi's father took a step forward, his voice low and dangerous. "What do you want?" Hralok's eyes flicked back to Levi, lingering for a moment before he spoke again. "I want to know why you are here." The question hung in the air, and for the first time, Levi felt the weight of it. Why were they here? Why had they come to this planet, to this place that didn't belong to them? He had never asked that question before, had never thought to. But now, standing on the edge of the world, looking down at the alien leader who spoke with such quiet certainty, Levi couldn't help but wonder. Why were they here? The storm hit with no warning. One moment, the air had been thick with heat, the oppressive weight of the afternoon sun pressing down on Levi's skin, and the next, the sky split open. Rain poured down in sheets, turning the once firm ground into a slick, treacherous landscape. Trees groaned and swayed under the force of the wind, their branches snapping like brittle bones. The world had become a blur of movement, a cacophony of sound that swallowed everything. Levi stumbled forward, his boots sinking into the mud with every step. His breath came in ragged gasps, the wet air burning his lungs. He had wandered too far from the colony, too deep into Caldara's wilderness. The path was gone now, washed away by the rain, and he had nothing to guide him but instinct. His mind raced with half-formed thoughts, fragments of warnings his father had given him, but they were drowned out by the storm's fury. He wasn't supposed to be here. A crack of thunder split the sky, and Levi flinched, his hands instinctively rising to shield his face. His foot slipped, and he went down hard, the cold mud sucking at his limbs as he tried to push himself back up. For a moment, he just lay there, his body trembling with exhaustion, the rain beating down on him like a punishment. And then, through the roar of the storm, he heard it, a sound that didn't belong. It was low at first, almost imperceptible against the wind and the rain, but it grew louder, deeper, resonating in his bones. It wasn't a cry or a growl, it was something else, something primal. Levi's heart raced as he pushed himself to his knees, his eyes scanning the trees for the source of the sound. There, just beyond the edge of the clearing, something moved. At first, it was nothing more than a shadow, a flicker of movement in the corner of his vision. But as Levi focused, he saw it in enormous shape, larger than anything he had ever seen before, moving slowly through the trees. It was hunched low to the ground, its limbs thick and powerful, its body covered in dark, matted fur. It moved with a kind of deliberate grace, each step measured, despite the weight it carried. Levi's breath caught in his throat. This was no ordinary creature. He had heard the stories, the legends of the Hralok, a beast that had roamed Caldara's wilderness for as long as anyone could remember. Some said it was a guardian of the land, a force of nature that no one could tame. Others believed it was a warning, a reminder that there were things in this world that humans would never understand. The Elara spoke of it with reverence, as though it were not a creature at all, but something greater, something that existed beyond the boundaries of life and death. Levi had never believed the stories. Until now. The Hralok moved closer, and Levi's muscles tensed. His instincts screamed at him to run, to get as far away from the beast as possible, but something held him in place. He watched as the creature emerged from the trees, its massive frame towering over him, its breath coming in slow, labored huffs. It was wounded. A deep gash ran along its side, blood seeping from the wound and mixing with the rain. Levi's mind raced. He should leave. He should turn and flee before the creature noticed him, before it decided he was a threat. But his legs wouldn't move. Instead, he found himself staring into the Hralok's eyes, dark, bottomless eyes that seemed to hold the weight of the world. The storm faded into the background, the wind and rain, nothing more than a distant murmur. In that moment, there was only the beast, standing before him, and Levi felt something shift inside him. The fear was still there, sharp and gnawing at the edges of his thoughts, but something else had taken its place. Empathy. It didn't make sense. The Hralok was a force of nature, an untamable creature that had existed long before humanity had set foot on this planet. It was dangerous, wild, everything Levi had been taught to fear. But as he looked into its eyes, he didn't see a monster, he saw pain. The creature's chest heaved with every breath, and its body trembled with exhaustion. The wound in its side was deep, and the blood loss had already begun to take its toll. The Hralok was dying. Levi could see it now, in the way the beast swayed on its feet, in the way its movements had become slower, less deliberate. It was losing the fight. Without thinking, Levi took a step forward. The mud sucked at his boots, and he stumbled, but he didn't stop. His heart pounded in his chest, but it wasn't fear that drove him now. It was something deeper, something that had been building inside him for as long as he could remember. The Hralok's eyes followed him as he approached, its massive head turning ever so slightly. There was no aggression in its posture, no warning growl or snap of teeth. It simply watched, as though it, too, was trying to understand what was happening. Levi knelt beside the creature, his hands trembling as he reached out toward the wound. The blood was warm, hot even, and it flowed freely over his fingers as he pressed his hand to the beast's side. The Hralok let out a low, rumbling sound, but it didn't move. It simply watched him, its dark eyes filled with something that Levi couldn't quite name. For a moment, they stayed like that, Levi and the Hralok, two beings from different worlds, bound by something neither of them could fully comprehend. The rain continued to pour, soaking through Levi's clothes, but he didn't notice. He didn't care. All that mattered was the creature before him, the bond that had formed in the space between them. Levi didn't know how long they stayed like that. Time seemed to lose all meaning, the world shrinking down to just the two of them. But eventually, the Hralok let out a low, rumbling breath, its body slumping to the ground. The fight was over. The beast had given in. Levi's heart sank as he felt the creature's strength fading, its life slipping away with every passing second. He had known, from the moment he saw the wound, that there was nothing he could do. But that didn't make it any easier. He stayed there, his hand resting against the Hralok's side, until the creature's breathing slowed, then stopped altogether. The rain had begun to let up, the storm passing as quickly as it had come. But Levi didn't move. He couldn't. In the quiet that followed, the forest seemed to hold its breath, as if the very world had paused to mourn the passing of the creature that had once ruled it. The Hralok was gone, but the weight of its presence still lingered, heavy and profound. Levi stood slowly, his legs stiff and unsteady. His mind was a blur of thoughts, emotions swirling inside him like the remnants of the storm. He didn't know what had just happened. He didn't understand the connection he had felt, the bond that had formed between him and the creature. But he knew, deep down, that it had changed him. The Hralok had been more than just a beast. It had been a mirror, reflecting back the parts of himself that Levi had always tried to ignore: the fear, the loneliness, the raw, untamed emotions that he had buried deep inside. And now, standing in the aftermath, Levi couldn't help but feel as though he had lost a part of himself, too. As he turned to leave, his eyes lingering on the still form of the Hralok one last time, Levi knew that this encounter would stay with him. The bond he had shared with the beast would haunt him, shape him in ways he couldn't yet understand. It was the beginning of something bigger than himself, something that would challenge everything he thought he knew. The storm may have passed, but Levi knew that the real trial was just beginning. The rain had long since passed, leaving the air thick with the scent of wet earth and the quiet hum of distant life. Levi stood at the edge of the wilderness, eyes scanning the trees that had once seemed so impenetrable, so full of secrets. Now they felt different. The encounter with the Hralok had changed him. His heart still pounded with the memory of it, the moment when he had reached out, not with fear or dominance, but with something deeper, something he couldn't yet name. The colony was behind him now, its lights barely visible in the distance, a dull glow against the early morning fog. It was safe there, familiar. And yet, standing here, Levi felt something pulling him back into the wilderness, toward the place where the Hralok had fallen. The settlers had whispered of the beast for generations, passing down stories in hushed tones. The Hralok had become a symbol of everything untamable, the one thing that humanity, despite all its advancements, could not control. To the colonists, it was more than a creature. It was a myth, a threat, a reminder that even here, on a new world, there were forces they could never conquer. And yet, Levi had seen the Hralok for what it truly was: wounded, vulnerable, alive. He had felt its heartbeat under his hand, had watched the light fade from its eyes. It wasn't a monster. It wasn't an enemy. It was something else. Levi adjusted the strap of his pack and took a step forward, the ground soft and yielding beneath his feet. He had to go back. He didn't know why, didn't understand the pull that drew him deeper into the wilderness, but he knew he couldn't ignore it. Not after what had happened, not after the connection they had shared. The forest was quiet this time. No storm, no howling wind or sheets of rain to blur his senses. Just the stillness of the trees, the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze. Levi moved carefully, each step deliberate, his eyes scanning the underbrush for any sign of movement. He didn't expect to find the Hralok again, not after its death, but something inside him told him to return to the place where it had fallen, to understand what had happened, to make sense of the bond they had formed. As he approached the clearing, Levi's breath caught in his throat. The body of the Hralok was gone. His heart raced, and for a moment, panic surged through him. Had the colonists found it? Had they taken the creature away to study, to dissect, to treat it as a curiosity or a threat? But then he saw its footprints, deep in the mud, leading away from the clearing. The Hralok hadn't been taken. It had risen. It had walked away. Levi crouched down, tracing the edges of the tracks with his fingers. The prints were fresh, the ground still soft from the rain. The beast had survived. He stood slowly, his mind racing. The Hralok was still out there. Wounded, yes, but alive. And something inside him, some deep, unspoken part of him, knew that their bond wasn't finished yet. There was something more here, something he couldn't explain. A connection that went beyond words, beyond understanding. Levi followed the tracks, moving deeper into the wilderness. His movements were slow, careful, each step deliberate. The forest seemed to close in around him, the trees growing thicker, the underbrush denser, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. The pull was too strong. Hours passed. The sun rose higher in the sky, its light filtering through the canopy in soft, golden rays. The forest was alive with the sounds of insects, the distant calls of birds, but Levi heard nothing except the steady rhythm of his own heartbeat, the quiet crunch of leaves underfoot. And then, through the trees, he saw it. The Hralok. It was lying on its side, its massive body curled, in the shade of a large, gnarled tree. The wound on its flank was still visible, though it no longer bled as heavily. Its breathing was slow, labored, but steady. Levi's chest tightened at the sight relief mixed with an odd sense of anticipation. The creature's presence was even more imposing in the daylight, its fur glistening with dew. Its sheer size dwarfed anything in the natural world Levi had encountered. And yet, despite its terrifying reputation, it radiated a strange calm now. Its dark eyes, once wild with pain, were half closed in a state that Levi could only describe as acceptance. Levi stopped a few paces away, kneeling slowly to avoid startling it. His pulse quickened again, but it wasn't fear. It was something else, an unspoken understanding, an invisible thread between them. The Hralok shifted slightly, its eyes flickering open just enough to acknowledge him. No growl, no aggression, just quiet acknowledgement. For a long moment, Levi simply sat there, his breath slow and steady, mirroring the beast's labored rhythm. He felt something he hadn't expected, a sense of mutual recognition. This was not the submission humanity craved when it thought of taming the wild. This was coexistence. The Hralok wasn't an adversary to be defeated or a force to be mastered. It was a being alive, autonomous, sharing the same world as Levi and his people. Levi shifted slightly, lowering his pack to the ground, careful not to break the quiet between them. From inside, he pulled out a canteen of water and a small cloth. The wound was still open, and infection was a real threat, even to something as resilient as the Hralok. Slowly, deliberately, Levi reached out, offering the cloth. The Hralok's nostrils flared, its eyes following his movements, but it didn't recoil. It was watching, studying him with the same intensity Levi had when they first encountered one another. There was an intelligence behind those dark eyes, something beyond mere instinct. Levi reached forward, the cloth gently pressing against the creature's wound. It twitched, muscles tensing under his touch, but it made no move to push him away. His hands were steady as he wiped away the dirt and dried blood, the cool water from the cloth mixing with the creature's own warmth. It felt like a small, almost insignificant gesture, yet it was more than that. It was trust. Time stretched between them. Levi lost track of how long he sat there, tending to the Hralok's wound, his mind quiet, his movements deliberate. The forest around them seemed to breathe in rhythm with their stillness, the rustling leaves and distant animal calls becoming a backdrop to the quiet bond forming between them. He wasn't sure why he was doing this. He wasn't sure what compelled him to return to this place, to sit beside a creature his people had feared for generations. But in that moment, none of it mattered. The Hralok wasn't just a symbol anymore. It was real flesh and blood and breath, and Levi couldn't walk away from that. Back in the colony, Levi's absence had not gone unnoticed. The settlers were a practical people, survivors. They had carved out a life on this planet through sheer determination, building homes and growing crops in the face of an unforgiving wilderness. But even in their practicality, the myth of the Hralok loomed large. It was the one thing they couldn't predict, couldn't control. A force that stood as a reminder of the untamed wild that surrounded them. Levi had always been a bit of an outsider among the settlers. He wasn't as interested in building the future as the others. He didn't share the same need for control, for mastery over the land. He had always felt more at home on the edges of the colony, where the wilderness began. The others noticed this about him, but they had chalked it up to eccentricity until now. Now, whispers spread through the settlement like wildfire. Levi's gone back to the woods, someone muttered over the evening fire. Saw him heading out right after the storm. They say he's been following the Hralok's trail, another voice added, a note of fear creeping into their words. What does he think he's doing? A third person snapped. That beast isn't something you chase down. It's a threat. He's going to get himself killed or worse. Lead it back here. Others stayed silent, their faces etched with worry. They had all heard the stories, the ones passed down from the first settlers, about those who wandered too far into the wilderness and never came back. The Hralok wasn't just an animal to them. It was the embodiment of everything unknown, everything they couldn't predict or prepare for. It was the one part of this world that refused to bend to their will. And now Levi, the quiet one, the outlier, was walking straight into its jaws. The Elara, too, had their own understanding of the Hralok. While the settlers feared the beast, The Elara revered it. To them, the Hralok was not a threat, but a guardian and ancient force that maintained the balance between nature and the encroachment of civilization. They spoke of it in hushed, respectful tones, as though it was something sacred, not to be interfered with or provoked. Among the Elara, the belief was that the Hralok had existed long before the humans had arrived on this planet, long before the Elara had built their villages and temples. It was said that the Hralok had once been the protector of the forests, a being born of the earth itself. To harm it, to seek to control it, was to disrupt the very fabric of life on Caldara. The Elara elders had seen the signs in the days following the storm, the subtle shifts in the wind, the strange quiet that had settled over the forest. They knew something was happening. They felt it in their bones. But unlike the settlers, they did not panic. They did not fear. Instead, they watched. For days, Levi returned to the Hralok's side. He brought food, small offerings of dried meat and water, though the creature rarely ate. Its wound, while healing slowly, still limited its movements. Levi watched from a distance, observing the way it moved, the way it reacted to the forest around it. He began to learn its patterns, to understand the subtle shifts in its posture, the meaning behind its low, rumbling growls. It was never tame, never docile. The Hralok was still a force of nature, untouchable in its own way. But there was a mutual respect between them now. Levi no longer felt the need to assert his dominance, to prove anything to the creature or to himself. Instead, he focused on understanding it, on learning from it. And in return, the Hralok began to trust him. It was a slow process, painstakingly slow, but Levi felt it growing with each passing day. The creature allowed him closer now, let him tend to its wound without flinching. It no longer eyed him with suspicion, no longer tensed at his approach. It was a subtle shift, almost imperceptible, but it was there. Levi spent hours in the forest, sitting quietly beside the beast, listening to the sounds of the wilderness. He had never felt more connected to this world, more in tune with its rhythms. The Hralok wasn't just a creature anymore, it was a part of the landscape, a living embodiment of everything Levi had always sensed but never fully understood. Back in the colony, the settlers grew restless. "Levi's still out there," someone said one night as they gathered around the fire. "He's been gone for days now. What if the Hralok?" "He wouldn't be the first to disappear," another voice cut in, grim and resigned. "Maybe we should go after him," a third voice suggested, though it was clear from the tone that they weren't eager to face the beast themselves. The fear was palpable now, simmering just beneath the surface. They had built their lives here, carved out a place for themselves in this wild, unpredictable world. But the Hralok was a reminder that not everything could be tamed, that not everything would bend to their will. And Levi's absence, his choice to walk into the wilderness instead of staying within the safety of the colony, only deepened that fear. For Levi, though, the days passed in a blur of quiet understanding. The Hralok had stopped being a mystery, stopped being a threat. It was simply there, a part of his world now, just as he was a part of its. As he sat beside the creature one afternoon, the sun filtering through the canopy in soft, golden rays, Levi felt a shift deep within him. He no longer saw the world as something to be conquered or controlled. The wilderness wasn't an enemy. It wasn't something to fear. It was alive, full of beings like the Hralok, beings that existed beyond humanity's grasp, beyond their need for dominance. Levi had found something here, in the quiet of the forest, in the presence of the creature. A different way of being, one of coexistence, not control. The Hralok stirred beside him, its dark eyes opening slowly to meet his gaze. For the first time, Levi felt a true connection, an unspoken bond that went beyond fear, beyond survival. It was trust. And with that trust came a deeper understanding. Levi didn't need to tame the beast. He didn't need to control it or bend it to his will. All he needed was to listen, to learn from it, to be a part of this world in a way that humanity had long forgotten. And in that moment, sitting beside the Hralok, Levi knew that he had found something far more powerful than control. He had found harmony. The Elara Council Hall was unlike any human structure Levi could have imagined. set deep within the ancient groves of Caldara. Its towering walls of woven roots and stone gave the illusion of being cradled by the earth itself. The council gathered in silence, the weight of their history and tradition palpable in the air, as though the very ground they stood on had absorbed the deliberations of generations past. The ceiling, open to the sky, allowed pale light to filter in, dappling the stone floor in shifting patterns that mirrored the council's own uncertainty. Hralok stood at the edge of the circle, his long fingers tracing the grooves of his staff. He could feel the pulse of the roots beneath his feet, a reminder of the connection the Elara shared with the land, with the forces of nature they had long sought to live in harmony with. Every Elara, from the youngest to the most ancient, carried the weight of that bond. It was woven into their rituals, their songs, their very way of thinking. And yet today, that bond felt strained, as if the presence of Levi had introduced a new, disruptive current into their carefully balanced world. The council had been debating for hours. Voices rose and fell, each carrying the gravitas of centuries-old tradition, but none finding the resolution they sought. The elders sat in their designated seats, their expressions marked with concern, their gestures measured. Some argued that Levi was a threat, a human child who had already crossed the boundaries of what was acceptable. They spoke in guarded tones, reminding each other of the volatile nature of humanity, their relentless need for control, for dominance over the land that had once belonged to no one. Others, though fewer in number, saw Levi's bond with the Hralok as something more, a sign, perhaps, that the old divisions between their species could be bridged. It was a rare thing for any creature of Caldara, let alone a Hralok, to allow such proximity to a human. That alone stirred the minds of the more contemplative among the council. But even among these voices of openness, there was hesitation, a lingering doubt that whispered through the chamber like the wind through the leaves outside. Hralok had listened in silence for most of the meeting, his mind turning over the complexities of the situation like a stone in his hand. He knew, as well as anyone, the gravity of what had occurred. Levi had formed a connection with the Hralok, a creature that even the Elara revered as untamable, a force beyond their understanding. That bond was undeniable, yet what it meant was something even Hralok struggled to define. As the debate circled back on itself, Hralok's voice finally broke through the murmur of the council. His tone was measured, deliberate, but there was an edge of tension beneath it, something unspoken, yet pressing. "Levi is not like the humans we've encountered before," he said, his eyes scanning the faces of the council. "He has chosen a different path, one that we cannot easily classify. It is true that he does not belong to us, and yet, his bond with the Hralok cannot be ignored." The elders shifted in their seats, some leaning forward with curiosity, others narrowing their eyes with suspicion. "The Hralok is not a creature that allows itself to be dominated," Hralok continued. "It has never bowed to human control, nor even to our own. And yet, Levi has formed something with it, something none of us can explain." "You speak as if this bond is a good thing," one of the council members interrupted, her voice sharp. "But how can we trust a human child, one who doesn't understand our ways, our balance? He could upset everything we've built here." Hralok turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "I do not claim to understand it fully myself," he admitted. "But I have seen the boy. I have watched him with the Hralok. There is no force, no violence in his approach. He does not seek to control the creature, he simply exists alongside it. There is harmony, not conquest." The silence that followed his words was thick with contemplation. The council members exchanged glances, their thoughts unreadable, but their minds clearly working through the implications of what Hralok had said. Hralok's gaze drifted to the ground, where the roots of the great trees intertwined beneath the stone. He could feel the pulse of the earth there, steady and constant, but there was something else now, a subtle disturbance, like a ripple in a still pond. It was Levi. It was the human child who had come into their world, who had formed an impossible bond with a creature of legend. It was a disruption, yes, but not one born of malice or ignorance. It was something different. Hralok's thoughts wandered as the council continued to debate, his focus slipping away from the words around him. He thought of the boy, sitting beside the wounded Hralok, his movements careful, deliberate. Levi was young, but there was something in his eyes and awareness, a stillness that Hralok had rarely seen in humans. It was as though Levi had touched something beyond his understanding, something that most humans never even considered. And yet, Levi approached it with care, with respect. The image of Levi, his hands gentle as he tended to the creature, stayed with Hralok. It was not the image of a conqueror, nor of a child lost in a world too large for him. It was the image of someone searching for a place, not just in the world, but within himself. Hralok found himself torn between his duty to his people and the inexplicable connection he felt to the boy. He knew what the council expected of him. He knew that, as a member of the Elara's ruling body, his duty was to uphold their traditions, to maintain the delicate balance between their people and the world around them. And yet, every time he thought of Levi, every time he considered the bond the boy had formed with the Hralok, he felt something pull at him, a quiet voice, deep within, urging him to consider a different path. As the council meeting wore on, Hralok's mind continued to churn, his thoughts caught in a web of uncertainty. He knew the importance of balance, knew it better than anyone. It was the foundation of Elara society, the principle that had guided their people for generations. But balance, he had learned, was not a static thing. It was not a rigid law, unchanging and unyielding. It was fluid, ever-shifting, adapting to the world as it grew and changed. And now, that world was changing. Levi represented something new, something the Elara had not anticipated. He was not a threat, not in the way the council feared. But he was a disruption, a force that could tip the scales in ways they had yet to understand. And that, more than anything, was what gave Hralok pause. The council had always sought to maintain equilibrium, to preserve the harmony between the Elara and the world around them. But what if that balance was no longer enough? What if, in their desire to maintain the status quo, they were missing something greater, something that could only be found by embracing the unknown? Hralok glanced up at the council members, their faces etched with concern and uncertainty. He knew they were waiting for his final word, for his judgment on the matter. And he knew that his decision would carry weight, would shape the course of events to come. But even as the weight of that responsibility settled on his shoulders, Hralok felt a quiet certainty growing within him. It was not a certainty born of logic or tradition, but something deeper, something that resonated with the pulse of the earth beneath his feet. Levi was not a threat. He was a possibility. And possibilities, Hralok knew, were the heart of balance. When the meeting finally adjourned, Hralok lingered in the hall, his mind still turning over the council's discussions. The others filed out, their voices low, their expressions still marked by uncertainty. But Hralok remained, his eyes drifting to the open sky above, where the light had begun to fade into twilight. The air was cool, carrying with it the faint scent of the forest beyond, and Hralok let the stillness settle over him like a cloak. He thought again of Levi, of the boy's quiet determination, of the way he had approached the Hralok without fear, without the need to dominate or control. It was a rare thing, Hralok knew, to find such stillness in a human, such an ability to listen, to observe without imposing one's will. And in that moment, as the stars began to emerge in the deepening sky, Hralok made his decision. He would not stand in Levi's way. He would let the boy's path unfold, as the roots of the great trees grew and twisted in ways that could not always be predicted. And in doing so, he would honor the balance, not the balance of the past, but the balance that was still yet to come. Levi moved cautiously through the dense underbrush, each step sinking into the soft, loamy soil of Caldara's untamed wilderness. The air felt thicker here, saturated with the scent of damp earth, and the musk of living things hidden just beyond sight. The canopy above was a mesh of ancient branches, their gnarled limbs woven so tightly together that only slivers of sunlight filtered through. When those rare beams did break through, they illuminated patches of moss-covered stones, leaving the world below cast in a dim, eternal twilight. The Hralok moved ahead of him with a grace that belied its massive form. Its dark fur rippled with each stride, muscles coiling and releasing in fluid motion. Levi had seen the creature's power firsthand, but here in the depths of the wilderness, it seemed to blend into the environment, as though it had been born from the earth itself. Every time the Hralok's massive paw touched the ground, it did so soundlessly, a hunter's step honed by millennia of survival. Levi tried to mimic that quiet precision, but the forest seemed to resist him. Each movement felt clumsy in comparison, his footfalls cracking twigs, rustling leaves. He had grown accustomed to the human colony, where every surface was controlled, every path laid out for easy travel. Here, nature imposed its own rules, indifferent to human order. Yet the Hralok did not appear to mind Levi's presence. It did not glance back to check on him, nor did it slow its pace for him to keep up. There was something wordless in that, an understanding that Levi was no longer an outsider in this place, even if he still stumbled now and then. The bond between them had deepened, a quiet connection forged not through words, but shared moments, through trust and proximity. Levi had learned to move in tune with the Hralok's rhythm, to sense its shifts in direction before they happened. As they ventured further, Levi began to notice the other creatures of the forest. At first, they were only shadows moving at the edges of his vision, silent, swift, indistinct. Then, as if sensing the presence of the Hralok, they grew bolder. Creatures the size of small dogs, with sleek bodies and bright, glassy eyes, darted between the trees. Winged beasts, almost too quick to catch a glimpse of, flitted overhead, their wings beating the air with a low, resonant hum. Levi caught himself holding his breath, not out of fear, but awe. One particular creature, a massive stag with antlers that seemed to grow more like twisted vines than bone, stepped into Levi's path. Its eyes locked onto his with an intelligence that felt almost too human. Levi's heart pounded as the Hralok came to a stop beside him, not in aggression, but with the same quiet patience it had shown when they first met. The stag's nostrils flared as it scented the air, and then, with a dip of its head, it turned and disappeared back into the undergrowth, its departure as silent as the wind. Levi exhaled slowly. There was no mistaking it, these creatures recognized the bond between him and the Hralok. It was not respect in the way humans might understand it. It was more primal, as if the creatures of the wilderness saw him as part of something larger, something they were also connected to. It was a sense of belonging, but one that Levi had never felt in the colony, where walls separated humans from the outside world, and order was imposed with heavy hands. The deeper they ventured, the more Levi began to feel that connection, not just with the Hralok, but with the land itself. The wind in the trees whispered to him in a language he could not yet fully understand, but he felt its meaning all the same. The rustling of leaves, the distant calls of animals, the rhythm of life in this place, it was as if the planet was speaking to him, not in words, but in sensations, in rhythms that pulsed through the very ground beneath his feet. His thoughts began to drift, unanchored by the constraints of human logic and order. He had been raised in a world of structure, of plans and rules and technology designed to control the environment, to tame it. But here, the idea of control felt absurd, even alien. Nature did not need to be tamed. It existed in a balance more profound than anything humans had ever managed to create. And in that balance, Levi was beginning to feel his place. He wasn't sure when it had happened, but the sense of longing he had always carried with him, the feeling that he didn't quite belong anywhere, had begun to shift. The wilderness was vast and untamed, but it didn't ask him to fit a mold or adhere to a role. It simply was. And within that vastness, Levi felt himself unraveling, not in a chaotic way, but in a way that allowed him to breathe deeper, to exist without the weight of expectations. The Hralok stopped suddenly, its ears flicking forward as it crouched low to the ground. Levi, instinctively, mirrored its movements, lowering himself into the brush beside the creature. His senses sharpened, attuned to the silent signals the Hralok gave off. Ahead, in a small clearing, a pack of sleek, silver-furred animals circled around what looked like a downed creature. Their movements were fluid, efficient, every gesture a testament to the wild's law of survival. Levi watched in silence, his breath slow and steady. The pack's leader, a large, scarred animal, lifted its head and gazed directly at the Hralok. For a moment, the two creatures locked eyes, and an unspoken exchange passed between them. The pack did not flee, nor did they attack. Instead, they parted, allowing the Hralok and Levi to pass through the clearing without interference. It was a small thing, but it spoke volumes to Levi. These animals did not challenge them because they recognized the Hralok as something beyond themselves. And, by extension, they recognized Levi as part of that same world. It was not dominance that held the wilderness in balance, but understanding, a subtle dance of give and take, of knowing when to act and when to simply exist. As they moved beyond the clearing, Levi felt something settle within him. It was the realization that the wild did not demand anything from him. It offered no promises, no guarantees. It was indifferent to his survival, to his presence. And yet, in that indifference, there was freedom, a freedom he had never known within the walls of the colony. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, casting long shadows through the trees, Levi found himself standing at the edge of a vast, open plain. The forest gave way to rolling hills, covered in tall, golden grasses that swayed gently in the evening breeze. The sky above was a brilliant expanse of orange and red, the colors deepening as the sun sank lower. The Hralok stood beside him, silent, but its presence felt more like a companion than a guide. Levi's gaze swept across the plain, and for the first time in days, he thought of the colony. He thought of the people there, the walls that had once felt like a shield, but now seemed more like a cage. He thought of their fear of the wilderness, their need to control it, to bend it to their will. And then he thought of the Hralok, of the creatures they had encountered, of the silent understanding that had passed between them. The colony had been his home, but here, in the wild, he had found something deeper. He had found a place where he didn't have to conform to the expectations of others, where he didn't have to prove himself or fit into a role. The wilderness didn't care about such things, it simply was. And in that simplicity, Levi had found a sense of belonging that he had never known before. As the last light of day faded from the sky, Levi felt a pull deep within him. It was not the pull of the colony, nor the call of the human world he had known. It was something older, something primal, a connection to the land that resonated within him, as though he had always been a part of it, but had only just now realized it. The Hralok turned its gaze to him, its eyes glowing faintly in the twilight. Levi met that gaze, and in that moment, he knew he stood at a crossroads. He could return to the colony, to the safety of walls and human order. Or he could stay here, in the wild, where the rules were different, where belonging was not about control, but about coexistence. He didn't have the answers yet, but as he stood there, with the wind in his hair and the earth beneath his feet, Levi knew that the wild had called him, and he wasn't sure if he could ever truly return to the world he had once known. The sky over the colony had taken on an unsettling hue. Clouds hung low, thick and heavy with the promise of rain, though none had fallen for days. The air buzzed with tension, sharp and electric, as if the atmosphere itself mirrored the growing unrest among the settlers. People moved about with lowered voices, their conversations hushed but urgent. It was as though something fragile was on the verge of breaking, the cracks already forming beneath the surface. Inside the central meeting hall, the council gathered in their usual formation. They sat in a tight circle, faces drawn with worry, illuminated by dim light from the sun lamps above. It was a makeshift chamber of authority, a blend of human ingenuity and necessity. The wood-paneled walls had been fashioned from trees harvested during the early days of settlement, still bearing the deep grain of their Caldaran origins. The table at the center, once a symbol of unity, now felt like a barrier between the divided members. A woman spoke first, her voice trembling at the edges, but not with fear, more with uncertainty. Levi's been gone too long. We have no idea what he's doing out there, or if he's still one of us. He could have changed. There was a murmur of agreement, and the weight of that word changed hung in the room like a specter. To the colonists, Levi had represented a glimmer of hope, a symbol of humanity's ability to adapt to this wild, foreign world. Now, he was a question mark, a mystery with no clear answer. Captain Jonas, the de facto leader of the colony, stood slowly, his broad shoulders casting long shadows against the walls. His face, usually calm and steady, was hard, etched with lines of concern. We cannot afford to wait much longer. We don't know what's out there, and frankly, we can't assume Levi's in control of himself anymore. He paused, letting the gravity of his words sink in. We need to prepare. If Levi's gone rogue, if he's become something else, we'll have to face that reality. Across the table, Dr. Kiera spoke up, her voice sharp with defiance. And what would that look like? Jonas? How do you suggest we prepare? Are we really ready to label him a threat? He's just a boy. He was a boy, Jonas corrected, the word cutting through the room with a finality that made the others fall silent. But he left us. We have no idea what he's been through, what he's done. For all we know, he could bring something back to the colony that we can't handle. Kiera's eyes flashed, anger rising in her voice. Or he could come back with knowledge, something we need to survive in this world. You can't just write him off because you're scared of what you don't understand. Jonas met her gaze, unflinching. I'm not writing him off. I'm protecting this colony. The debate raged on, but the underlying fear was clear. Levi had become an unknown, and that terrified them more than anything the wilderness might throw their way. Outside, as the meeting grew more heated, whispers spread among the settlers. Some believed Levi had been lost to the wilds, that he had become a danger to them all. Others held on to hope, seeing him as the only chance they had of truly understanding the world they had chosen to inhabit. The colony was fracturing, lines being drawn, trust eroding. Levi, far from the growing unrest of the colony, crouched low beside the Hralok as they moved through the tall, swaying grass. The wind stirred the grass in long, rhythmic waves, and the land stretched wide in every direction. For days, Levi had ventured further into the wild, following the Hralok's lead, his senses attuned to the world around him in ways he had never thought possible. His bond with the Hralok had deepened. It was no longer a mere truce, a tentative alliance of survival. They moved together now, a rhythm between them that felt almost instinctual. Levi had learned the creature's habits, its mannerisms, its quiet way of observing the world before acting, and he had started to adopt some of those habits himself. He had begun to understand what it meant to be part of something larger than himself, to move with nature rather than against it. But as they ventured deeper into the untamed lands, something shifted. The Hralok, usually so calm and controlled, stiffened, its fur bristling slightly. Levi's body mirrored the tension, though he wasn't entirely sure why at first. His eyes scanned the horizon, the tall grass obscuring much of the land beyond. There was no sound, no immediate sign of danger, but the air felt different, charged, expectant. Then, from the shadows of the hills ahead, a figure emerged. It moved with a deliberate, predatory grace, its eyes fixed on the Hralok. At first, Levi thought it was another Hralok, perhaps part of its pack, but something about it was off. Its coat was darker, almost a charcoal black, with streaks of ash running along its limbs and spine. Its muscles rippled with each calculated step, but its posture was more aggressive, its eyes narrowed in challenge, rather than recognition. This was no ally. The Hralok beside Levi let out a low, rumbling growl, deep and resonant, as if sending a clear message to the intruder. Levi could feel the vibrations through his own body, an instinctive warning that this was not a situation he could control with words or reason. The darker predator circled them, its gaze flicking between Levi and the Hralok, sizing them both up. It moved with a cold precision, its movements sharp and deliberate, like a blade being drawn from its sheath. Levi's muscles tightened, his mind racing. He had fought before, he had faced danger, violence, and even death, but this was different. This was not a fight for dominance. It was survival, plain and raw, a test of his ability to defend not only himself, but the bond he had forged with the Hralok. There was no room for hesitation here, no second chances. The Hralok lowered its body slightly, its muscles coiling like springs, ready to strike. Levi had learned to trust its instincts. There were things it knew, things it understood about this world that went beyond Levi's comprehension. And yet, a thought gnawed at the back of his mind. What if he was meant to intervene? What if this challenge wasn't just between the predators, but a test for him as well? The decision came in a split second, the kind of clarity that only life or death moments could bring. Levi's hand reached for the knife at his side, a tool he had come to rely on less and less in his time with the Hralok. but one that felt necessary now. His fingers tightened around the handle, the worn grip comforting in its familiarity. But as he held the weapon, a new thought struck him, a realization that made him pause. This was not his fight, at least not in the way he had once thought. Levi stepped back, just a fraction, allowing the Hralok to stand fully in front of him. The creature moved with purpose, its eyes never leaving the dark predator. The two animals circled each other, their muscles tense, but there was a strange grace in their movements, a rhythm Levi had not expected. This was a language of the wild, something ancient and primal, something Levi had to respect, even if he didn't fully understand it. The dark predator lunged first, a blur of muscle and teeth. But the Hralok was faster, pivoting with astonishing agility, dodging the attack with mere inches to spare. The two beasts clashed, their bodies slamming into each other with a force that sent shockwaves through the ground. Levi could feel it in his bones, the sheer power of these creatures, the raw energy of their struggle. But as he watched, Levi realized something else. This was not just about physical dominance. There was something more at play here, something deeper. The way the Hralok moved, its precision, its restraint, it wasn't just fighting to kill. It was fighting to protect, to defend its territory, its bond with Levi, and something more intangible. It wasn't driven by mindless aggression or a need to conquer. It was defending a balance, a relationship between itself and the world around it. Levi's grip on his knife loosened as the realization settled into him. He didn't need to strike. He didn't need to control or dominate. This was about coexistence, about understanding his place in this world and finding harmony within it. The Hralok didn't need his intervention. It needed his trust. The fight reached its crescendo with a final, brutal exchange of blows. The dark predator, realizing it had misjudged its opponent, hesitated for just a moment too long. The Hralok seized the opening, its claws raking across the predator's flank in a swift, decisive motion. The dark beast stumbled, blood pouring from its side, but it didn't attempt another attack. Instead, it backed away slowly, its eyes still locked on the Hralok. There was no fear in its gaze, only acknowledgement. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, the dark predator melted back into the grass, vanishing into the landscape. The Hralok stood tall, its breathing heavy but steady. It had won, but more than that, it had maintained the balance it so fiercely protected. Levi watched in silence, his heart still pounding in his chest, but his mind was calm. He understood now. This was not a world that could be conquered, not by force, not by will. It was a world that demanded respect, understanding, and patience. The Hralok had taught him that today, not through words, but through action, through survival. Levi knelt beside the Hralok, his hand resting gently on its fur. It didn't flinch or pull away. Instead, it stood beside him, their breaths slowly falling into sync. There was no need for words. The connection was there, silent but profound. As the wind stirred the grass around them, Levi gazed out at the horizon, his thoughts far from the divided colony that awaited him. He would return, but not as the boy who had left. He was something else now. He was part of this world, bound to it in ways he hadn't fully understood before. And he wasn't afraid. The sun was barely cresting the horizon when Levi sensed something different in the air. The stillness, once comforting in its silence, now felt pregnant with expectation. His senses, sharper after weeks spent surviving in the wilderness, prickled as he walked alongside the Hralok. The creature moved easily beside him, its every step deliberate, alert to the rhythms of the land. Levi had learned to trust it without question, allowing their bond to guide him. But today, there was something foreign that even the Hralok could not decipher. The grasslands stretched wide around them, the sky above painted with pale shades of morning. There were no sounds of approaching footsteps, no scent of an animal on the wind, but Levi knew something was coming. And then, from the mist, a figure emerged. Hralok, cloaked in the muted colors of the Elara, stood before him, his presence blending seamlessly into the landscape, yet distinct in a way that commanded attention. The Elara had a way of existing in the natural world that seemed effortless, as though they were as much a part of the planet's ecology as its trees and rivers. Levi stopped, his hand instinctively resting on the Hralok's side. For a long moment, neither spoke. The Hralok tensed slightly, but Levi's hand steadied it. There was no immediate threat in Reller's posture, though his arrival was anything but casual. "I've been watching you, Levi." Reller's voice was quiet but carried weight, like the steady flow of a river carving through stone. There was no malice in his tone, yet his words were heavy with significance. "We have all been watching." Levi didn't reply immediately, his eyes scanning the Elara's face. It was unreadable, as it always had been, though there was something deeper lurking beneath the surface, now a tension that hadn't been there before. "You didn't come just to observe, did you?" Levi asked, his voice calm but firm. Reller allowed a small pause, his gaze shifting briefly to the Hralok at Levi's side. "No, the time for merely watching has passed." Levi nodded slowly, the meaning behind Reller's words sinking in. He had known this moment was coming, had felt it building ever since his connection with the Hralok had deepened. The Elara weren't a passive people. They acted when they felt it was necessary, and now, with Levi caught between two worlds, they were here to make their move. "We have seen what you are becoming," Reller continued, stepping closer. His movements were fluid, as though he were floating just above the earth. "You've formed a bond with a creature that could bring balance to your people, or tear them apart. That is why I'm here." Levi met his gaze, unblinking. "And what is it that you think I'm becoming?" The question hung in the air between them, and Reller seemed to consider it carefully before answering. "That is not for me to decide. It is something only you can understand." His voice softened, though the seriousness remained. "But the Elara have discussed this, your bond with a Hralok. Some see it as a dangerous path, one that could lead to destruction if you are not careful. Others believe it could be the key to a deeper understanding, a way for your kind to truly connect with this world." Levi stayed silent, his thoughts turning inward. He had known, on some level, that the Elara were paying attention. They had always been watchers, their intentions veiled in layers of silence and distance, but he hadn't expected them to intervene so directly. "What do you believe?" Levi asked, his voice quiet, though the question was anything but simple. Reller paused, his gaze steady. "I believe you are walking a line that no one else has walked before. There is a chance for you to find something few have, a harmony with the world that goes beyond survival or domination." His eyes darkened slightly, as though a shadow passed through him. "But if you fail, the consequences will be catastrophic. Not just for you, but for all who follow." Levi's fingers tightened on the Hralok's fur, but his face remained calm. He had wrestled with these thoughts himself, lying awake under the stars at night, wondering if this connection he felt was a gift or a curse. "Why now?" he asked, narrowing his eyes. "You've known about the Hralok and me for some time. What's changed?" Reller's expression grew more serious. "Your people are afraid. They do not understand what you've become, and fear has a way of spreading faster than any truth. If they turn against you, they will turn against this world as well. The Elara will not allow that." The ultimatum hung unspoken between them, but its meaning was clear. The Elara were no longer content to watch from afar. They would intervene if necessary, whether to guide or to stop Levi, he couldn't be sure which. Levi felt the weight of it pressing on him. He glanced at the Hralok beside him, the creature's golden eyes gleaming with an intelligence that was both alien and familiar. It had chosen him just as he had chosen to follow it, but what did that choice mean? "I didn't ask for this," Levi said softly, his words half to himself. "I didn't choose to be a symbol for anyone." Reller's gaze softened, a rare flicker of understanding passing through his usually stoic demeanor. "No one ever does. But that is the nature of destiny, Levi. It chooses you. The question is not whether you asked for it, but whether you will accept it." Levi frowned, the weight of those words settling heavily on his shoulders. He had never believed in fate, in some grand design that dictated his path. But here, on this world, with the Hralok at his side and the Elara watching from the shadows, it was hard to ignore the feeling that his actions were part of something larger, something he was only beginning to comprehend. Hralok stepped forward, his voice quieter now, almost as if they were sharing a secret. "We are not so different, you and I. The Elara have placed expectations on me as well, expectations that I sometimes struggle to meet. But I have learned that we cannot always walk the path others have set for us. Sometimes we must forge our own." Levi met his gaze, and for the first time he saw Hralok not as an alien observer, but as someone who understood the burden of choice. They stood there, two beings from different worlds, bound by the same struggle, the same need to find their place in a universe that did not offer easy answers. "What do you want from me?" Levi asked after a long pause. Hralok's response was simple. "We want you to choose, not for us, not for your people, but for yourself. Decide what kind of life you want to lead here, and whether you will let fear shape that choice." Levi nodded slowly, his mind racing with possibilities. This wasn't about following orders or adhering to some predetermined path. It was about something much more fundamental. It was about the kind of person he wanted to become, whether he would allow himself to be defined by the fears of others, or by his own vision for the future. The wind stirred the grass around them, the landscape vast and open, filled with both promise and peril. Levi felt the enormity of the moment, the weight of it pressing down on him, but for the first time, it didn't feel like a burden. It felt like an opportunity. Hralok's voice broke the silence once more, softer this time. "Whatever you decide, know that we will be watching, but we will not interfere unless you give us reason to." With that, Hralok turned and began to walk away, his form dissolving into the mist as quickly as he had appeared. Levi watched him go, his mind still buzzing with the conversation, the choices that lay ahead. The Hralok nudged him gently, as if sensing his inner turmoil, and Levi smiled faintly, his hand resting on the creature's side. He had been given a choice. Now it was time to decide what he would do with it. Levi stood at the edge of the clearing, his breath steady, but his heart carrying the weight of a decision he had never wanted to make. The air felt thick with the tension of what was to come. He could hear the distant clamor of the colony footsteps pounding, the unmistakable click of weapons being prepared, and voices raised in anxious frenzy. His people were scared, and fear, he knew, could make even the most rational person dangerous. Beside him, the Hralok paced slowly, its massive body moving with a fluidity that belied its size. Its golden eyes, always keen, now flicked between the distant colony and Levi himself, as if sensing the storm about to break. They had come far together, Levi and the creature further than he had thought possible when he first ventured into the wilderness. Their bond had grown not through words or simple trust, but through shared survival, through understanding the rhythms of the world they now lived in. But that bond was about to be tested in ways neither had anticipated. He glanced down at the creature, his hand resting on its coarse fur. The Hralok's breathing was slow and deliberate, but Levi could sense its unease. The creature knew, just as he did, that something was coming. They were connected now, their fates intertwined, but the path ahead was anything but clear. Levi's mind churned with the choice he faced. He had felt it growing ever since his conversation with Hralok, the Elara emissary. Hralok had spoken of choice, of destiny, and of the need for Levi to decide not for others, but for himself. But how could he make such a choice when the stakes were so high? If he returned to the colony, he would have to face the full force of their fear and their weapons, aimed not just at him, but at the creature beside him. And if he stayed in the wild, he would be turning his back on his people, on everything he had ever known. The sun, now fully risen, bathed the clearing in a harsh light, casting long shadows that seemed to mirror the internal battle raging within him. "I didn't ask for this," Levi whispered to himself, though the Hralok's ears twitched, as if it had heard and understood. The creature let out a low rumble, a sound that Levi had come to associate with concern. He looked toward the distant colony, barely visible beyond the trees. He could feel the vibrations of their movement, the anger and confusion that pulsed through the air, growing thicker by the minute. They were coming for him, or rather, for the Hralok. To them, it was a threat, an unknown that needed to be destroyed. They could not see what Levi had seen, could not feel the connection that had grown between him and the creature. To them, The wild was something to be tamed or eradicated, not something to be understood. He had spent too much time with the Hralok to think that way anymore. But that didn't make the choice any easier. The sound of snapping branches pulled him from his thoughts. From the tree line, 3 figures emerged, scouts from the colony. Levi recognized them immediately. Their faces, once familiar and friendly, were now hardened, wary. They held their rifles at the ready, though they hadn't aimed them yet. "Levi," one of them called out, his voice tense. "We're here to bring you back. The council wants to talk." Levi could see the sweat on the man's brow, could hear the unspoken threat in his words. It wasn't just a request, it was an ultimatum. "Come back, or we'll make you." "I'm not going back," Levi said, his voice steady but firm. His hand rested more firmly on the Hralok's side now, a gesture of solidarity that did not go unnoticed by the scouts. The one who had spoken, a man named Hralok, took a step forward, his eyes narrowing. "Levi, don't be stupid. That thing beside you, it's dangerous. We've seen what it can do. You can't possibly think it's safe to be out here with it." Levi met his gaze, his jaw tightening. "It's not dangerous unless you make it dangerous. It's part of this world, just like we are." Hralok's expression shifted, a flicker of something passing behind his eyes, fear, anger, confusion. "That's not how the council sees it. They think you've gone rogue, Levi. That thing's got its claws in you, and you're not thinking straight." Levi felt a surge of frustration rise in him, but he kept his voice calm. "I'm thinking more clearly than I ever have, Hralok. The Hralok isn't the problem. It's us. We're the ones who came here, thinking we could control everything. But this planet isn't something you control. It's something you learn to live with." Hralok glanced at the 2 scouts beside him, both of them shifting nervously. "You've been out here too long, Levi. You've lost touch with what's real." Levi shook his head. "No, I've found what's real. And what's real is that the Hralok and we've made a connection. It's not some mindless beast. It understands more than you think." Hralok's grip tightened on his rifle, and for a moment, Levi thought he might raise it. But the man hesitated, his eyes flicking between Levi and the creature beside him. "The council's not going to wait much longer, Levi. They've already voted. If you don't come back with us, they'll send the militia, and you know what that means." Levi's heart pounded in his chest. He knew all too well what that meant. The militia wasn't coming to negotiate. They were coming to kill. "I'm not going back," Levi repeated, his voice quieter now but resolute. "Not if it means letting them kill the Hralok." Hralok's face hardened, the last vestiges of understanding slipping away. "Then you've made your choice." He motioned to the other scouts, and they began to back away, their rifles still at the ready. Levi watched them go, his mind racing. The tension in the air had thickened to the point of suffocation. He could feel the inevitable collision approaching, a clash that would tear everything apart. He turned to the Hralok, its golden eyes meeting his. The creature let out a low growl, as if sensing the danger that was closing in. Levi knelt beside it, his hand resting on its neck. "We have to go," he whispered, though the words felt empty. There was nowhere to run, not really. The colony was too close, the Elara too far removed to intervene. The wild was vast, but not vast enough to escape what was coming. As he rose to his feet, a new sound reached his ears, distant at first, but growing louder by the second. It was the unmistakable hum of engines, the steady march of boots through the brush. The militia was coming. Levi's breath quickened, his mind racing through the possibilities. There had to be another way, some way to stop this before it spiraled out of control. But every option seemed to lead to the same conclusion: conflict. Bloodshed. He couldn't let that happen. Not here. Not now. The Hralok nudged him gently, its massive head brushing against his arm. Levi looked down at the creature, his heart aching. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about something much deeper, a connection that went beyond the simple bond of man and animal. The Hralok had chosen him, and in doing so, it had placed its trust in him. And now, that trust was being put to the ultimate test. He couldn't betray that trust, no matter the cost. The sounds of the militia grew louder, closer. He could see them now, moving through the trees like shadows, their weapons drawn and ready. They moved with a cold precision, their faces set in grim determination. These were men and women he had known, people he had worked alongside, laughed with, shared meals with. And now they were coming for him. Levi took a step forward, his body tense but his mind clear. He could feel the Hralok at his side, its presence grounding him. There was no more time for hesitation. The moment of reckoning had arrived. As the militia emerged from the tree line, their leader, a man named Cole, stepped forward, his rifle slung over his shoulder. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a face that spoke of hard decisions and harder times. "Levi," Cole said, his voice carrying over the clearing. "You know why we're here." Cole's gaze shifted to the Hralok, his expression unreadable. "You need to come with us, now." "I can't do that," Levi replied, his voice steady but filled with the weight of the decision he had made. "I won't let you kill it." Cole's jaw tightened, a flicker of something passing through his eyes. "It's not up to you anymore. The council's decided." Levi took another step forward, his hands at his sides. "I don't care what the council's decided. This creature, this world, it's not something you can control. It's something you have to live with. And if you can't see that, then you're the ones who are lost." Cole's face darkened, his hand moving to the rifle slung across his chest. The tension in the air was palpable, the line between words and violence growing thinner by the second. Levi's heart pounded in his chest, but he stood his ground. This was his choice. This was his moment. "I won't let you do this," he said quietly, but with a conviction that shook the air around them. The militia stood ready, weapons raised. And the reckoning began. The cold dawn light seeped through the dense canopy, casting long shadows over the makeshift camp where the colony's soldiers had gathered. Their chatter filled the air, a mixture of nervous anticipation and hardened resolve. They were preparing for war, not against another human enemy, but against the wild, the unknown. Levi stood at the outskirts of the camp, his eyes fixed on the scene before him. His stomach churned as he watched the soldiers don their armor, check their weapons, and steel themselves for what was to come. He had always known that this moment would arrive, but the reality of it was heavier than he had anticipated. The Hralok, hidden just beyond the tree line, was a silent presence in his mind. It had become part of him, a connection that was as deep as it was inexplicable. Levi could feel the creature's unease, its wariness of the humans who sought to destroy it. But the Hralok wasn't simply a wild animal to him anymore, it had become a symbol of something far greater. It represented the untamed, the unbroken, the natural world that humanity had long sought to control. He took a deep breath and stepped forward, weaving his way through the camp toward the command tent where Captain Darius, the colony's leader, was holding court. The man had always been an imposing figure, tall, broad-shouldered, with an air of authority that few dared to challenge. His presence alone could command respect, but Levi knew that Darius's strength lay not just in his physicality, but in his unyielding belief that humanity was destined to conquer whatever lay before it. As Levi approached, he could hear Darius's voice, deep and firm, giving orders to his lieutenants. There was no hesitation, no doubt in his words, just certainty. It was a certainty that unnerved Levi, for he knew that it left no room for understanding, no space for doubt or reflection. Levi paused outside the tent, his heart pounding. He knew what he had to do, but the weight of the confrontation that awaited him felt immense. His fingers tightened into fists as he gathered his resolve. This wasn't just about the Hralok anymore, it was about something far larger. It was about the choices humanity was making, and what those choices would mean for their future on this world. With a final breath, he stepped into the tent. Darius stood at the center, poring over a map spread out on a large table. His lieutenants flanked him, their eyes flicking to Levi as he entered, but none of them spoke. Darius looked up, his piercing blue eyes locking onto Levi's with a cold intensity. "You're not supposed to be here, Levi," Darius said, his voice steady but laced with irritation. "This is a military operation now. You've made your choice staying out there with that creature, so why are you here? Levi swallowed the lump in his throat. I'm here because you're making a mistake. Darius raised an eyebrow, his gaze never wavering. A mistake? You've aligned yourself with a beast, Levi. A monster that threatens everything we've built here. You think that's a mistake? Levi stepped closer, his voice calm but filled with urgency. You don't understand the Hralok. You don't understand what it represents. It's not just a beast, it's part of this planet. It's part of something we don't fully grasp. Darius's expression hardened. I don't need to understand it, Levi. All I need to know is that it's a threat. And threats are eliminated. That's how we survive. Levi shook his head, frustration bubbling beneath his calm exterior. Survival isn't about dominance, Darius. It's about coexistence. We can't just conquer everything we don't understand. That's not how we should live. Darius's jaw tightened, his hands gripping the edges of the table. You sound like the Elara, always talking about balance and harmony. But that's not how the world works, Levi. It's us or them. If we don't take control, we're the ones who'll be wiped out. Levi felt a surge of anger rise within him, but he kept his voice steady. Is that what you really believe? That the only way forward is to destroy everything that's different from us? That's fear talking, Darius. You're afraid of what you don't understand. Darius's eyes flashed with something anger, perhaps, or pride. Fear keeps us alive, Levi. It's what makes us strong. If you're not afraid, then you're a fool. Levi met his gaze, unflinching. Maybe fear isn't the only way. Maybe there's another path, one that doesn't lead to destruction. Darius let out a low, bitter laugh. You've been out in the wild too long. It's twisted your mind. You think you can live alongside that thing? You think it won't tear you apart the moment you let your guard down? Levi's heart raced. This was the crux of it, the divide between them. Darius saw the world in black and white, humans versus the wild, control versus chaos. But Levi had come to see something else, something deeper. The Hralok wasn't just a mindless beast, it was part of a larger system. A system that had existed long before humanity had set foot on this planet. I know what you're thinking, Levi said quietly, his voice carrying an edge of sadness. You think the Hralok is just another enemy to be defeated. But it's not. It's part of this world in a way that we're not. And if we destroy it, we're destroying something we don't even understand. Darius's face darkened, his lips pressed into a thin line. We're not here to understand, Levi. We're here to survive. And survival means making hard choices. If you're not willing to make those choices, then you're no longer part of this colony. Levi's stomach twisted. He had known this moment was coming, but hearing it spoken aloud still hit him like a blow. He was being cast out not just from the colony, but from the world he had once known. The weight of that realization settled over him like a heavy cloak, but beneath the sadness there was something else. A clarity, a sense of purpose that had been growing inside him ever since he had bonded with the Hralok. I'm not afraid of making hard choices, Levi said softly, but I won't make the choice to destroy something just because we don't understand it. That's not survival, that's destruction. And if that's the path you're taking, then I can't follow you. Darius's eyes narrowed, his hands clenching into fists. Then you're a fool, and you'll die out there, just like the rest of the wild things. Levi didn't flinch. Maybe, but at least I'll die knowing I tried to understand, knowing I didn't let fear make my decisions for me. The tension in the room was palpable, a silence hanging between them like a drawn blade. Darius stared at Levi for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, without another word, he turned away, his attention returning to the map spread out before him. You've made your choice, Darius said coldly. Now leave. Levi stood there for a moment longer, the weight of the decision settling over him. He had chosen a path, one that led away from the colony, away from the life he had once known. But as he turned to leave, he felt a strange sense of peace. The wild, with all its dangers and mysteries, was where he belonged now, and the Hralok was waiting. As he stepped out of the tent, the sunlight hit his face, and he took a deep breath of the cool morning air. The camp buzzed with activity, but to Levi, it felt distant like another world, one he no longer recognized. He made his way through the camp, his eyes scanning the faces of the soldiers who were preparing for the hunt. They didn't look at him, didn't acknowledge his presence. To them, he was already gone, an outsider, a traitor. But Levi didn't care. His path was clear now. As he reached the edge of the camp, he felt a presence beside him. The Hralok, silent and watchful, had emerged from the trees, its golden eyes locked onto his. Levi reached out and placed his hand on the creature's head, feeling the familiar warmth beneath his fingers. "We're not going to let them destroy you," Levi whispered, his voice barely audible. "We're going to find a way." The Hralok let out a low, rumbling sound, and Levi felt the connection between them strengthen. This wasn't just about survival anymore, it was about something far deeper, something that transcended the simple struggle between man and nature. Together, they turned away from the camp and walked into the wild, leaving the colony behind. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with danger and unknowns. But for the first time in a long time, Levi felt a sense of purpose, a clarity that cut through the noise of fear and doubt. The Hralok was not a beast to be tamed or destroyed. It was something to be understood, to be learned from, and in understanding it, Levi knew he would come to understand himself. The journey was far from over, but Levi no longer walked it alone. The forest stretched endlessly before Levi as he and the Hralok ventured deeper into the wild. The sounds of the colony faded behind them, replaced by the rustling of leaves, the hum of life that thrived in the untamed. Levi's senses felt heightened, the bond with the Hralok pulling him into a new realm of awareness. It wasn't just the sharpness of his surroundings that caught his attention, it was something deeper, more ancient, coursing through the very air he breathed. Levi had chosen to leave behind everything he once knew. The path was uncertain, but with the Hralok at his side, he felt guided by a purpose that was only beginning to reveal itself. His connection with the creature had deepened in ways he hadn't thought possible. It wasn't just a bond of mutual respect. It was something more primal, something that felt almost sacred. The Hralok moved silently beside him, its golden eyes scanning the forest with the same calm intensity it always carried. Levi could sense the creature's presence not just physically, but mentally, as if a new line of communication had opened between them. It wasn't speech, it was far subtler, a series of impressions, emotions, and instincts that flowed between them like a river. As they walked, Levi felt a strange sensation tugging at the back of his mind. It was as if the Hralok was trying to show him something, to guide him somewhere beyond the immediate present. He slowed his pace, glancing at the creature beside him. "What is it?" Levi whispered, though he knew the Hralok couldn't respond in words. But the Hralok's gaze met his, and in that instant, Levi was flooded with a cascade of images and emotions too fast to grasp at first. But gradually, they slowed, crystallizing into something coherent. He wasn't in the forest anymore. The world around him shifted, dissolving into a vision of the past, a time before humanity had arrived on Caldara. He saw the planet as it once was, untouched, vast, and teeming with life that moved in perfect balance. The trees were taller, their roots weaving deep into the earth, connected to something much larger than themselves. The sky was a deep, unbroken blue, and the air hummed with the energy of a living, breathing world. Levi could see the Elara, not as they were now, but as they had been, wilder, more connected to the planet itself. They moved through the landscape with an ease that spoke of a profound understanding of their place within it. There were no walls, no barriers between them and the world around them. They lived in harmony with the creatures of the planet, and Levi saw for the first time the true nature of the relationship between the Elara and the Hralok. The Hralok were not mere animals. They were guardians, protectors of the balance that sustained Caldara. The Elara had discovered this long ago, learning that the Hralok were not to be tamed or controlled, but understood. They were living manifestations of the planet itself, beings that embodied the harmony between life, death, and rebirth. The Elara had come to revere them, not out of fear, but out of respect for the power they represented. Levi felt a surge of emotions that weren't entirely his own. The Hralok's presence was with him in this vision, guiding him through the memories of its kind. He saw how the Elara had lived in harmony with the Hralok for centuries, how they had protected the planet together, ensuring that its natural balance remained intact. But then, the vision shifted. Levi saw a time when the balance began to falter. He saw the arrival of humans, their technology, their cities, their desire to dominate the land. The harmony that had existed for so long began to fracture, as humanity's need for control clashed with the natural rhythms of the planet. Levi's heart sank as he watched the slow erosion of what had once been so perfect. The Elara had tried to warn humanity, to show them the way. But the humans had been too blinded by their need for progress, for control. And now, the balance was teetering on the edge of collapse. The vision faded, and Levi was once again standing in the forest. But the weight of what he had seen lingered, settling over him like a heavy cloak. He understood now. The Hralok wasn't just a creature, it was a part of something far greater. It was the embodiment of the planet's will, a guardian of the balance that humanity had disrupted. Levi turned to the Hralok, his breath shaky. "You're not just an animal," he murmured. "You're a part of this world in a way I never understood." The Hralok's golden eyes met his, and Levi could feel the acknowledgement in that gaze. It wasn't just a beast. It was a guardian, a protector of the planet's most sacred balance. And Levi was now part of that as well. But what did that mean for him? Could he go back to the colony, knowing what he now knew? Could he stand by and watch as humanity continued down its path of destruction? Or would he have to choose a different path, one that put him at odds with his own people? The questions weighed heavily on him, and he knew there were no easy answers. But one thing was clear. His bond with the Hralok was deeper than he had ever imagined. It wasn't about taming the creature or exerting control. It was about understanding, about balance, about harmony. As Levi and the Hralok continued their journey through the forest, a new awareness settled over him. He could feel the pulse of the planet beneath his feet, the rhythm of life that flowed through every tree, every creature. It was all connected: humans, Elara, Hralok, Caldara itself. They were all part of the same intricate web, bound together by forces that stretched beyond any single species or civilization. And yet, humanity had forgotten this connection. They had severed themselves from the natural world, building walls around themselves, both physical and mental, that separated them from the harmony that once existed. The Hralok, in its own way, was a reminder of what had been lost. Levi felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. He had been chosen, in a way, to bridge the gap between humanity and the wild. But how? How could he convince Darius that the Hralok wasn't a threat, that it was something to be protected, not destroyed? As they approached the outskirts of the forest, a familiar figure emerged from the shadows. It was Elara, the Elara woman who had first warned Levi about the dangers of the Hralok. Her eyes, always filled with a quiet wisdom, now held something else: fear. "You've seen it, haven't you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Levi nodded, feeling the weight of the vision still heavy in his mind. The Hralok, it's not just a creature. It's a guardian, a part of this planet in a way I never understood. Elara's expression softened, though the fear in her eyes remained. "We have known this for generations, but we feared telling the humans. We feared that they would try to exploit the Hralok's power, as they have exploited so much else." Levi frowned. "Exploit its power? What do you mean?" Elara glanced at the Hralok, her voice lowering. "The Hralok is connected to Caldara itself. It draws its strength from the planet, from the very life force that sustains this world. In a way, it is the planet, and if the humans were to understand that, they might try to use that power for themselves." Levi's mind raced, trying to comprehend the implications of what Elara was saying. If the Hralok was a living manifestation of Caldara's power, then what would humanity do if they discovered that? Would they see it as just another resource to be harnessed, to be controlled? "I can't let that happen," Levi said quietly, more to himself than to Elara. "I won't let them destroy the Hralok." Elara nodded, her gaze filled with a mixture of hope and sadness. "Then you must choose, Levi. You must decide whether to return to your people or to remain here as a bridge between worlds." Levi looked at the Hralok, his mind swirling with conflicting emotions. He had always been torn between two worlds, the world of humanity and the world of the wild. But now, the choice felt more real, more immediate. He couldn't stand by and watch as the colony continued its path of destruction. But could he truly abandon his people? Could he forsake the world he had once known? The Hralok let out a low, rumbling sound, and Levi felt a surge of warmth flood his mind. The creature was offering him its strength, its understanding. It wasn't asking for control, it was asking for balance, for harmony. Levi closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the decision before him. The colony was preparing for war, and Darius would stop at nothing to destroy the Hralok. But Levi knew that the real battle wasn't just between man and beast, it was between two ways of life, two philosophies that couldn't coexist. One of dominance and control, the other of harmony and understanding. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the forest, Levi opened his eyes. His path was clear now, though it was fraught with danger. He would not abandon his people, but he would not let them destroy the Hralok either. He would walk the line between both worlds, no matter how treacherous it became. In the silence of the fading light, Levi whispered to himself, "Sometimes, the hardest path is not the one we choose, but the one we're given." And with that, he stepped forward, ready to face whatever lay ahead. Levi walked alongside the Hralok, the forest around them gradually darkening as the sun dipped below the horizon. The air was cool, and the soft whispers of the trees seemed to carry the echoes of ancient memories. Each step he took felt weighted with the gravity of the revelations he had just witnessed. His mind was a whirlpool of thoughts and emotions, each one vying for dominance as he tried to piece together the significance of the vision he had seen. The Hralok's presence was both reassuring and daunting. It moved with a grace that spoke of centuries of existence and understanding, its golden eyes reflecting the dying light in a way that made Levi feel as though he was seeing the world through an entirely new lens. The connection between them was no longer just a physical bond. It was something deeper, something almost spiritual. The creature was a living embodiment of the planet's essence, and Levi was acutely aware of the responsibility that came with this newfound knowledge. As they approached a clearing, Levi noticed the familiar presence of Elara waiting by the edge of the forest. Her figure was silhouetted against the backdrop of the twilight sky, and as she turned to face him, her eyes seemed to hold the weight of an entire civilization's hopes and fears. "You've seen it," she said softly, her voice carrying an undertone of both relief and sorrow. "The truth of the Hralok." Levi nodded, feeling the enormity of the situation press heavily upon him. "Yes, I've seen it. The Hralok is more than just a creature. It's a guardian of the planet, a reflection of its balance. It's everything." Isara's gaze was contemplative, and she took a step closer, her expression one of quiet resolve. "We have always known this, but revealing it to humans was a risk we were not willing to take. We feared that your people would see it as a resource to be exploited rather than a being to be respected." Levi sighed deeply, feeling the weight of the decision that lay ahead. If the colony discovers this, they might indeed try to use the Hralok's power for their own ends. But I can't let that happen. Not now that I understand what it truly represents. Elara nodded, her eyes reflecting a mixture of sadness and hope. "Then you must make a choice. You are caught between two worlds now, your people and this planet. Which will you choose?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implications. Levi's thoughts drifted back to the colony, to the people he had once considered his own. They were driven by fear and misunderstanding, their vision clouded by a desire to control what they did not understand. Yet they were his people, his home. Could he truly turn his back on them? He looked at the Hralok, its presence a constant reminder of the delicate balance that was at stake. The creature's eyes seemed to hold an ancient wisdom, as if it understood the enormity of the choice Levi faced. It was not just a matter of personal allegiance. It was about the future of two civilizations and the fate of an entire world. "I need to understand more," Levi said finally, his voice resolute. I need to know what it means to live in harmony with this world, to truly protect it, not just control it. I need to see if there's a way to bridge the gap between my people and the Hralok. Elara regarded him with a look of quiet approval. Very well. But be warned, your path will be fraught with challenges. The colony is preparing for a confrontation, and they will not understand your newfound perspective. Levi's expression hardened with determination. I know. But if there's a chance to prevent destruction, to find a way for humans to coexist with the Hralok, I have to try. As night fell, Levi and Elara made their way back to the forest edge. The sky was a deep indigo, dotted with stars that seemed to pulse with an ancient rhythm. Levi could feel the weight of the night, the silence of the forest surrounding him like a protective cloak. Before you go, Elara said, her voice breaking the stillness, there is something you must know. The Hralok's connection to Caldara is not just a matter of physical balance. It is a reflection of the planet's very soul. To protect the Hralok is to protect the essence of the world itself. Levi nodded, absorbing her words. He had seen the visions, felt the truth of them. The Hralok was not merely a creature. It was a living representation of Caldara's harmony, a manifestation of the planet's will. As he stepped away from Elara and made his way back toward the colony, Levi's mind was a tempest of conflicting emotions. He knew that the colony's leaders were growing increasingly desperate, their fear driving them to more extreme measures. Captain Darius, in particular, was not a man known for his patience or understanding. The confrontation that was brewing would not be one of mere words. It would be a clash of ideologies, of survival versus preservation. The path back to the colony was long and fraught with uncertainty. Levi's thoughts turned to his fellow colonists, to the friends and family he had left behind. They were not evil, they were simply scared, driven by a primal fear of the unknown. But fear could be a powerful motivator, leading to actions that could have devastating consequences. As he neared the outskirts of the colony, the lights of the settlement pierced through the darkness, a stark contrast to the serene, untouched forest. The sight of it filled Levi with a mixture of sadness and resolve. This was where he had come from, where he had grown up. Yet it was also the source of the conflict that threatened to tear apart the world he had come to love. Levi approached the main gate, where the guards, still wary after recent events, eyed him with suspicion. They had been on edge, expecting trouble, and Levi could see the tension in their posture. "Halt," one of the guards commanded. "What are you doing here?" Levi held up his hands in a gesture of peace. "I'm here to speak with Captain Darius. It's important." The guard exchanged a look with his companion before nodding reluctantly. "Wait here." A few moments later, Captain Darius arrived, his imposing figure cutting a stark silhouette against the dim light. His expression was one of stern resolve, and his eyes held the same cold determination that had marked their previous encounters. "What is it, Levi?" Darius asked, his voice carrying an edge of impatience. "We don't have time for games." Levi took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts. "I need to talk to you about the Hralok, about Caldara." Darius's expression darkened. "We're not interested in your mystical stories, Levi. We're preparing to deal with the threat, and we don't have time for distractions." Levi's resolve hardened. "It's not a threat, it's a guardian. The Hralok is a living embodiment of the planet's balance, a part of Caldara itself. If you destroy it, you're destroying the planet's very essence." Darius's eyes narrowed. "And how do you expect us to believe that? What proof do you have?" Levi's mind raced as he tried to find the words to convey the gravity of what he had learned. "I've seen it. The Hralok is not just an animal, it's a protector, a keeper of the balance that sustains this world. The Elara have known this for centuries. They have lived in harmony with the Hralok because they understand its importance." Darius crossed his arms, his gaze skeptical. "And you expect us to just take your word for it? We have seen nothing but danger from that creature. How can we trust anything you say?" Levi's voice grew more urgent. "Because I've seen it firsthand. I've felt the connection between the Hralok and the planet. It's not about control or domination. It's about understanding and balance. If you go through with this attack, You will be destroying more than just a creature, you will be destroying a crucial part of this world's equilibrium." The silence that followed was thick with tension. Darius's expression was a mask of uncertainty, his eyes betraying a flicker of doubt. Levi could see that he was grappling with the conflicting information, the fear of the unknown warring with the growing realization of the truth. "Give me time," Levi said, his voice softening. "Let me show you what I've seen. Let me help you understand." Darius studied him for a long moment before finally nodding. "Very well. You have a day. If you can convince me in that time, we'll reconsider our approach. But if not, we proceed as planned." Levi nodded, feeling a surge of relief mixed with anxiety. He knew that time was running short, and he needed to act quickly if he was to prevent the impending conflict. With a final glance at Darius, he turned and walked away, his mind racing with thoughts of how to bridge the gap between the two worlds. As Levi walked through the colony, the weight of his mission pressed heavily upon him. He knew that convincing the settlers of the Hralok's true nature would be a monumental task. They were entrenched in their beliefs, driven by fear and a desire for control. But Levi had seen the truth, and he was determined to share it, no matter the cost. The night was quiet as he made his way to the quarters of his fellow colonists. The lights of the settlement flickered softly, casting long shadows on the ground. Levi felt a pang of nostalgia as he passed familiar buildings, memories of his past life flashing before him. He was a part of this world, but he was also something more, a bridge between two vastly different realities. Entering his quarters, Levi took a deep breath and sat down at his desk. He needed to prepare for the next day, to find a way to convey the truth he had learned about the Hralok. It was not just about saving the creature. It was about preserving the delicate balance of Caldara itself. As he worked late into the night, Levi's mind was filled with thoughts of the Hralok, the Elara, and the future of his people. He was standing at a crossroads, and every decision he made from this point forward would have far-reaching consequences. The path he chose would not only affect his own fate, but also the fate of the planet and the relationship between humans and the natural world. The first light of dawn broke through the window, and Levi stood up, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. The day ahead would be critical, and he needed to be ready. He had to convince the settlers, to show them the truth of the Hralok and the importance of preserving the balance of Caldara. It was a daunting task, but one he was determined to see through. As he prepared to leave his quarters, Levi glanced back at the desk, where his notes and sketches lay scattered. They were not just pieces of paper, they were symbols of the journey he had undertaken, of the truth he had discovered. And now, they would serve as the foundation for his next challenge. With a deep breath, Levi stepped out into the morning light, ready to face whatever lay ahead. The path before him was fraught with uncertainty, but he was prepared to walk it with courage and conviction. He was no longer just a man caught between two worlds. He was a bridge, a mediator between humanity and the untamed wild. And as he made his way toward the colony, he knew that the decisions he made would shape the future of both. The sun climbed higher, casting its warm glow over the settlement. The day was bright, full of promise and potential. Levi knew that the challenges he faced were great, but he also understood that the journey was far from over. The true test of his resolve and understanding was yet to come, and he was ready to meet it head-on. He reached the meeting hall, where the settlers were gathering for the day's briefing. The atmosphere was charged with anticipation, the air thick with a tension of impending conflict. Levi took a deep breath and entered the hall, his mind focused on the task at hand. As he approached the center of the room, he saw the familiar faces of his fellow colonists, their expressions a mix of curiosity and apprehension. Captain Darius stood at the front, his gaze fixed on Levi with a mixture of expectation and skepticism. Levi stepped forward, his voice steady and resolute. "Thank you for giving me this opportunity. I know that the situation is critical, and I want to show you what I've learned about the Hralok and its significance to Caldara." The room fell silent as Levi began to speak, his words a careful blend of facts and personal insights. He described the visions he had seen, the connection between the Hralok and the planet, and the importance of preserving the balance that had existed for centuries. He spoke with conviction, drawing on his own experiences and the knowledge he had gained. As he spoke, he could see the reactions of the settlers shifting from skepticism to contemplation. The truth he presented was difficult to ignore, and the weight of his words was starting to sink in. Levi knew that it would not be an easy task to change entrenched beliefs, but he was determined to make them see the broader picture. The meeting continued, the discussions growing more intense as the settlers grappled with the implications of Levi's revelations. It was a day of reckoning, a moment where the future of both humanity and Caldara hung in the balance. And as Levi stood before them, he knew that the outcome of this day would shape the destiny of both worlds. The sun began to set, casting long shadows across the room. Levi's voice grew weary, but his resolve remained unshaken. He had presented his case, shared the truth he had discovered, and now it was up to the settlers to decide their course of action. As the meeting drew to a close, Levi felt a deep sense of anticipation and uncertainty. The decisions made today would have far-reaching consequences, and he could only hope that they would lead to a future where humanity and nature could coexist in harmony. The journey was far from over, but he was ready to face whatever came next, with the knowledge that he had done everything in his power to protect both worlds. As he left the meeting hall, Levi looked out at the settlement, the lights twinkling like distant stars. The path ahead was uncertain, but he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He was no longer just a man caught between two worlds. He was a bridge, a mediator, and a guardian of the balance that held both worlds together. And as the night descended, Levi knew that the journey was far from over. The true test of his resolve and understanding was yet to come, and he was prepared to face it with courage and determination. For in the heart of the darkness, there was always a glimmer of hope, a promise of a future where harmony and balance could be restored.